Hello and welcome to Today in Geography, a podcast produced by the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences at Michigan State University. Each episode, we talk with members of our community about their research and interests, and then we spend some time spotlighting events and celebrations that have shaped the field of geography. I'm Nathan Moore, an associate professor in the department, and I'll be your host for an engaging exploration of people, places, and stories that shape our world. Today, we are marking the anniversary of the failed launch of the Orbiting Carbon Observatory, but more on that later in our show. First, I'm joined today by Kyla Dahlin. Kyla, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Let's get to know a little bit about you and your adventures in geography. How did you get started in working on forests?
That's a great question. When I was in high school, I was interested in science, but I didn't really think that I wanted to be a full-time scientist. And so when I went to college, I thought that I was going to be a science journalist. And it wasn't until I was a junior in college that I took a class in forest ecosystem dynamics. And at the same time, I took my first geographic information sciences class, GIS. And realized, and I'd grown up liking maps. I'd always kind of been around people who liked maps in my family. And so it was the first time I'd seen that you could actually have a career that combined being outside and thinking about science, but thinking about ecosystem processes and also using maps and really trying to think about how systems all fit together. So that's how I first got interested in these topics.
At some point, you applied to graduate school and you started doing a little bit of work in doing some research. How did that get started and where did it lead you to?
Yeah. Also great questions. I was fortunate that I was able to do what was called a fifth-year master's. So in my undergraduate work, I was able to stay at the same institution and go on to a master's at the Yale, what was at the time called the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment. Now it's called Yale's Environment School. And so I did a master's degree in environmental management first, and that was really more management focused. And I worked in New York City developing forest management plans for parks in the city. That turned into a real job. And then I worked doing other kind of conservation GIS work for a couple of years. But I'd always known that I wanted to go back and get a PhD. I really like doing research and I like teaching. And so I wanted to have a career where I could do those things. And so I started applying to graduate programs. I applied to a lot of different ones, but they were all kind of in the space of using mapping. Remote sensing is what I mostly do. And so that's using satellite imagery and imagery collected from airplanes to look at patterns on the ground, specifically vegetation patterns in my case. And when I was looking for graduate programs, there were only a few in the United States that did that type of work. And I pretty much applied to all of them and then eventually ended up at Stanford and the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology.
I keep hearing you bring up the word conservation. I feel like there's a kernel. Is there some sort of kernel of inspiration when you were very young that sparked all this?
That's you would think so, but not really. I grew up in a like medium outdoorsy family, but we weren't super outdoorsy. I think it was more of a like later interest in college and in and post college that I got more interested in conservation. I think climate change was not really a huge topic when I was in high school. It was still the sort of save the rainforest, save the whales era of conservation. And it wasn't really until later that I got more interested in conservation topics.
What are some projects that you've been involved here at MSU that are of particular relevance to like the public?
That's a great question. A lot of the work that I do now is sort of adjacent to forest management. It's pretty technical as far as the computational work that we do, but the overall idea behind all of it is to inform how we manage forests and also to inform how we make predictions about how the Earth system works. So I have done a lot of work with what are called Earth system models, which are these computer models that try to predict how the climate is going to change, but also how land is going to change and how what we call biosphere-atmosphere interactions work. And so how vegetation informs what happens in the climate and how climate informs what happens to vegetation. And so I think even if people don't think that that is impacting their everyday lives, a lot of, long-term infrastructure planning and planning kind of for anything on a 50-year time horizon now has to take into account expectations around what the world's going to look like in 50 years. And oftentimes that involves using these Earth system models.
Is it that we know the world is changing at an accelerating speed and we don't have the tools to predict it well? Or is it a question of scale that things are changing much broader, or is it both? Why is business as usual no longer the right thing to do?
Yeah. Well, there's so many questions in the Earth system. I think what climate models now, I think we have a pretty good sense of kind of on average what we expect the world to look like in 50 years. The hardest part to predict is, of course, what people are going to do. People could dramatically change what the planet looks like in the next 50 years, for better or worse. But these predictive tools kind of allow us to simulate different possible future scenarios. So, one of the examples people use, right, is that we're basically doing an uncontrolled experiment on the Earth system right now by adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We don't know. We only have one Earth, and so we can't, run multiple experiments to see what it would be like if we made different choices. And so these Earth system models are really a computational way to try to do those experiments, to try to figure out, if we change this part of the system, how does that impact this other part of the system? And so it's not really about making a specific prediction or making that prediction better. It's about being able to make a range of predictions and tests and therefore understand more about kind of the suite of possible scenarios we might face in the future.
Okay. If you could take us on a field trip to a particular place where we could see some of these changes and some of these new forest management strategies, is there something that comes to mind that you could talk about and kind of walk us through, even though there's no 3D simulation right here, but that you could just sort of describe here on the microphones?
Yeah, I can try. Am I allowed to talk about the University of Michigan biological station? We got it. So a lot of work that I've been doing recently has been focused up at the University of Michigan's biological station, which is up in northern Michigan, just south of the Mackinac Bridge, basically. And it's a super interesting forest for a whole bunch of different reasons. It's been part of the University of Michigan for a long time. And it, most importantly, has been a place where they've done a lot of pretty major experiments looking at changes in forest structure and therefore function. So for people who've been to northern Michigan, they probably are familiar with this. Is mostly a hardwood forest, so it's oaks and maples and lots of aspen. And going back to, I think the first one was in 1936, they clear cut a small patch of land where and then let it grow back. And so there's been a series for almost 100 years of these patches where they've every decade or so clear cut and sometimes clear cut and burned to look at how the forest regenerates. And then in addition to that, in the kind of mid-2000s, there was an experiment where scientists went through and stem girdled. So they cut the bark off of a whole bunch of trees in a specific area, which kills them. And then it was, I think, about 30% of the forest canopy. And then they looked at how that forest regenerated. So it's your typical northern Michigan forest, except it's also been this site of these cool experiments. And so when you travel around it, or in my case, when you look at imagery of it from above, you can see these kind of patches and these changes to the structure that make it super interesting for thinking about these different potential types of disturbance and how they might impact or how they might look in the future.
Are there disturbances now in northern Michigan that your average northern Michigander is concerned about? Maybe changes in fire dynamics or animal species?
Yeah, I mean, there's been, of course, tons of conservation work and landscape scale management. The Kirkland's warbler is the most common example that people from northern Michigan are probably familiar with, where over decades they've managed forests to try to create habitat that this formerly endangered species, now it's been delisted, fortunately, because the conservation has been successful, but where they've really managed the whole landscape to create habitat that these birds like. The other big one that's impacting the University of Michigan Biological Station really dramatically right now is beech bark disease, which is killing off basically all the beech trees, which is a really common tree up north. And I'm sure people who are up there have seen the impacts of that.
And there's not a lot of genetic diversity to sort of insulate it, right?
Yes. Yeah, beeches, they stem sprout, so they kind of grow clonally. And so, they're not super diverse.
What are some projects you're working on now that are of interest to the public?
So the project that my group has been most specifically focused on has been really over the past almost decade trying to build three-dimensional models of forests at pretty fine spatial scales. So I work with a technology, a couple of technologies that are airborne. So we don't have, but there are airplanes that fly around and collect both what we call hyperspectral imagery, and then also LiDAR. So the hyperspectral imagery is basically like a camera, but it collects wavelengths in both the part of the spectrum that we can see, the visible, but also into the near infrared. And that allows us to estimate the concentration of nutrients in the top of the canopy. And then the LiDAR data is actually shooting a really low energy laser from the bottom of the plane, and it goes back and forth really, really quickly. And those returns, we call them point returns, give us information about the structure of the entire forest. And so what we've been doing is using those two types of data to build what we call these voxelized. Voxel is just a combination of, or shortening of volumetric pixel. So it's like a cube. And so we build these forest models where for each cube of forest, we can estimate how much leaf material is in that cube, how thick those leaves are, and then how much nitrogen is in those leaves. And so the next step, as we've done that, the next step is to run that through what's called a three-dimensional radiative transfer model, which is a very complicated sounding way of just describing a way that we predict how light moves through stuff, through a medium. And so in this case, it's light moving through the air, but then passing through these voxels of leaf material. And the idea from there is that once we know how much light is absorbed by each of these voxels, we can estimate how much carbon the voxels are taking up. And so that's kind of the first step in trying to really connect the changes in forest structure that we can see from things like these disturbance experiments or from real disturbances to ecosystem function and how much really
nutrients are flowing.
How the nutrients are flowing through the system, yeah.
Okay. And that's pretty valuable to your average citizen, right?
I would like to think so. I think, this is really basic science. And so it's not like I have a clear path from the work that we're doing now to a startup or something. There is now a world of carbon accounting. I was just at this conference where we were meeting with people who are doing really on the ground carbon accounting, which is much lower tech than what we do. The carbon accounting today is still really involves, for the most part, people on the ground measuring individual trees, although there's lots of interest in increasing the kind of technology around that effort as well. But, it's basic science to understand how forests work. And I think that there are management implications for it, as well as just basic understanding of how our world works.
A lot of this is funded by different federal agencies, right?
Yes.
Can you name a few of the agencies that have funded you in the past?
Yeah. Most of the work that I've been doing is funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about why federal funding for science is important to you and to the work that you and your colleagues do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's important for the reason I just said. The work that we do is not directly tied to a financial outcome. And so it's not necessarily the type of thing that a startup or that a funder would want to fund right off the bat because
And get quarterly returns.
and get quarterly returns from and like really see a clear line from the work that we do today and a profit in the relatively short term. I think the reason basic research needs federal funding is because even though those connections aren't always clear, there are lots of long-term benefits. But oftentimes basic research is a lot slower and a lot, again, less obviously financially beneficial. Even though, certainly in the case of like using LIDAR to understand forest structure, there is increasing interest in the kind of financial side in using those technologies. But these kind of basic cutting edge research topics are things that, again, aren't directly tied to financial benefits right now. And so that's why.
But by understanding the larger processes at play at local and regional and even national scales, those really pay off down the road, I think, in terms of understanding long-term implementations that can help manage our forests and our ecosystems better. And you work with one of these groups called NEON, right? Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what they do? What does NEON stand for?
Yeah, so NEON is the National Ecological Observatory Network, and it is a network of 81 sites around the United States where they collect all sorts of different ecological information. So the idea behind NEON started in the 1990s as the ecological community started to recognize the importance of being able to look at larger spatial scales and spatial extents to try to understand how ecosystems were changing.
That's good geography right there.
It is. It's totally geography. So prior to NEON, and still to this day, there's another program. They're both funded by the National Science Foundation. It's the LTER network, which is the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And the LTER system is fantastic, but it's really individual site focused. Each site proposes research that they want to do. And if they're fortunate, that gets funded. And they go on and do that work. And there's been efforts to try to combine that data because the LTER system is across the United States. But it's really hard to take, two different experiments that were maybe related but designed by different people for different things and try to kind of blend them together. And so NEON was set up with this intention of really having this systematic data collection across all of these different sites around the United States, including Hawaii and Alaska and Puerto Rico. So really getting a huge spread of climatic variability. And then at each of the sites, they collect the information I care about, so information about trees, information about atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, but they also collect information about beetle diversity and small mammals. They go out and look at phenology, so seasonal changes in plants. And they collect, what's cool, one of the things that they do that I think is really cool is they collect all of this data, even in places where it may not make sense today to collect it, but the expectation is that over time it will make sense. So an example is they collect ticks, which is not a job I would like to have, but I think they take like a piece of cloth basically and drag it through the landscape and then in a systematic way and then look at how many ticks they pick up. And they do this everywhere, even in Alaska, in places where we don't expect to find ticks. And that has allowed them to document ticks, showing up more frequently in places that they used to be found less frequently. Same for mosquitoes. Of course, there are already mosquitoes in Alaska, but there's a lot of different species of mosquitoes, and so they trap mosquitoes and look and set up traps for mosquitoes and consistently collect them again across the U.S. so that they can see how those populations are changing. And the whole NEON was designed to operate for 30 years, starting in 2019. And so the idea is that if it continues for that long, then we'll have this really incredible record of ecosystems around the United States and how they have changed over this important time period.
Like if you don't go looking for it, you're not going to find it. So we need to start looking aggressively.
Yeah.
You talk about how much you love trees. I hear that every time I talk to you.
That's true.
Where do you see your research going in the next few years? What are some problems out there that have really grabbed your attention?
Oh, they're all super technical and boring. Not boring to me, obviously. But so I'm really excited about this three-dimensional forest model kind of pipeline that we've been building. It's finally getting to a place where I think we'll actually be able to build these models relatively quickly and straightforwardly, which has been a struggle. It's computationally very expensive kind of at every step. But I think once we have that system in place, then there are lots of opportunities, not just for my own research, which is kind of focused on carbon and photosynthesis, but also there's potential applications for wildlife that could be really interesting, using these three-dimensional models of forests to kind of understand where different types of creatures, birds and what have you, show up in the canopy. And a lot of the work that I'm particularly interested in is kind of on the photosynthesis side. Right now, we are mostly focused on pretty basic ways of predicting how plants take up carbon. And there's a whole world of research that's much more technical in that space. And so starting to incorporate some of those more technical models is probably what we'll be focused on for the next couple of years.
Okay. If you were to talk to maybe students or volunteer listeners who are looking to get more involved in geography and forestry, what advice would you give them to get started?
Oh, gosh, I think it mostly depends on whether people want to sit around or if they want to get outside. Both are great options. There are, I think, for volunteers and for students, one of the coolest things you can do is get involved with a program called iNaturalist, which is an app that you can put on your phone. People might also be familiar with Seek, which is an app that's all produced by the iNaturalist folks. It's run out of the California Academy of Sciences, and it basically is a really easy to use citizen science app. And so actually, I'll start with Seek because it's maybe easier to understand. If you put the Seek app on your phone, you can take a picture of any animal or plant, and it will attempt to identify it for you. There's other apps that do this too, but Seek is kind of, broadly applicable across all we call taxa, all different types of species. It doesn't work great on grasses. I've been trying to identify some grasses.
I understand. I have a hard time identifying grasses.
Yeah, so do I. But it's super useful. And the reason it works so well is because it's built on top of this data set collected by iNaturalist. And so the way iNaturalist works is you go out in the field, you see some interesting plant or animal, you take a picture of it, you have your phone set up so that it takes a location recording as well, and then you can upload it to iNaturalist and you can try to identify it, or you can just say, I don't know what this is, but it looks cool. And then volunteer specialists from around the world will, depending on what it is, get kind of pinged, and they will take a look. And if 3 or 5 people agree on the identification of the species, then it gets identified. That gets put into a database, and then that information goes into the broader iNaturalist database, but also into other...
So it's mapped.
Bigger databases. Yeah, so it's mapped species occurrences around the world, and it's an incredible way to just, while you're out enjoying nature, to help, especially if you're going somewhere unusual, but even if you're in your backyard, to help scientists understand spatial patterns of plants and animals around the world.
Which is your bread and butter.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that the public should know about your work that we haven't covered already, or some last little insight maybe that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I'll just say, so I talked a little bit about neon, but I think that the value of these long-term monitoring projects, which is something that is generally hard to fund even through places like the National Science Foundation, because it's not super exciting and super, flashy in a short-term way. But the value of these long-term projects and long-term ecological monitoring is incredibly important. Trees live for much longer than we do, hundreds of years usually. And so even a 30-year time horizon is not really long enough to understand ecological processes in a meaningful way. But the more research we can do that is focused on long-term dynamics and that is focused on making sure the data we collect today will be accessible to people 200 years from now, I think that's incredibly important, even if it doesn't feel like it's going to have a return on investment in the next 5 years.
It's hard to put a price tag on some of these things that we value, but we don't know what they're worth.
Exactly.
Kyla, thanks so much for joining us today. We hope that people will come and explore your webpage and learn more about your research in the future. So today in geography, we are marking the failed launch of the Orbiting Carbon Observatory, OCO. Can you tell us about what OCO is and why it's important?
Yeah, and I will point out that it was the failure of the first launch, so there have been successful launches since then. But I thought as something to talk about and to talk about kind of the challenges that happen in science, I would talk about a story that didn't happen to me, but happened to a friend of mine and many other people. So on February 24th of 2009, the first Orbiting Carbon Observatory launched in what is now called what is now called Vandenberg Space Force Base, and failed to reach orbit. And in hindsight, is a funny story because fortunately there was another OCO2, which is the one that is currently orbiting, was able to launch a few years later. NASA had the resources to do that. And now there's actually an OCO3 that's on the space station collecting data more about the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, not so much about the amount of carbon that's on the ground. But I think what maybe people don't appreciate about satellite launches is the decades of work that go into planning them. And so a friend of mine was in graduate school at the time, as was I in 2009, and his entire graduate plan, the plan for the research he was going to do, was based on the data that they were expecting to get from OCO. His advisor was super involved in the planning of it. He went to the launch, and they all sat there and watched it crash into the ocean. He is fine, has a great job now, went on to basically do a lot of simulation, a lot of computer modeling of what the data might look like, because of course, when you're in graduate school, you can't just wait around for a couple of years for the data you want to be available for OCO2 to launch. And so it's pretty much when graduate students face setbacks, I always tell them the story of the OCO launch, just as a reminder that research is hard, things go wrong, and you can figure out ways to make lemonade out of lemons, as we say. But it is, again, it's funny now because everything worked out okay. But at the time, it was really difficult for a lot of people who were really excited to see this new type of data that was going to be available.
A cautionary tale for complex, high-value science.
Yes. And any type of science. Things always go wrong.
True. Kyla, thanks for coming and talking to us today.
My pleasure.
If people are interested in your work or learning more about NEON, where would you suggest they go?
Great questions. So for my own work, I maintain my own website, so it's not always super up to date, but it's at ersumlab.com, so erlab.com, which stands for the Ecological Remote Sensing and Modeling Lab. And then for Neon, actually, Neon has produced a lot of great videos that are up on YouTube. And so if folks like learning from YouTube, which I know a lot of people do, then checking out the Neon Science YouTube channel. There's lots of short videos on there that can explain a lot more of the individual types of science that Neon is doing.
Great. Thanks. We'll make sure to put that information in our show notes.
Thanks.
So that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for listening to Today in Geography from MSU's Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences. Be sure to subscribe and share, and join us next time as we continue exploring the people, places, and stories that shape the world around us.